The crates arrived on a Wednesday, which was already the kind of day that made a person suspicious. Callum had been elbow-deep in a '98 Silverado when the flatbed pulled into the lot, and he'd wiped his hands on a rag that was more grease than cotton before walking out into the thin October light to see what the fuss was about. The driver, a young man in a high-vis vest who looked like he hadn't slept since September, handed him a clipboard without saying much. Just pointed at the wooden crates stacked in the truck bed like they'd been arranged by someone who didn't particularly care what happened to them. "Sign here," the driver said. Callum looked at the crates, then at the paperwork. The name at the top of the invoice made him blink once, slow, Harwick Industries. Catherine Harwick, CEO. He'd heard the name. Everyone in Dunmore had heard the name. You'd have to be living under a very specific kind of rock not to know that Catherine Harwick had spent the better part of the last decade buying up every abandoned industrial property between here and Thunder Bay. She was the kind of woman whose name appeared in the Globe and Mail the way weather appeared, reliably, inevitably, and usually as a warning of something coming. Callum signed the clipboard. The crates held 5 vintage racing engines, British-sourced, mid-century, the kind of power plant that belonged in a museum or a very serious collector's garage. They had been pulled from a Harwick property in Sudbury, according to the attached note, a decommissioned manufacturing facility that was being stripped before demolition. The note, written in the clipped language of a legal department, said the engines were being disposed of as part of a property clearance, donated, technically, to whoever wanted them. Callum's name had come from someone at the Dunmore Heritage Preservation Society, who had apparently suggested, with more confidence than Callum had ever authorized, that he was the man for the job. He stood in the lot for a long time after the flatbed pulled away, looking at the crates. His daughter Meg came out of the office with 2 mugs of tea and handed him one without asking. She was 9, and she did things like that. Made tea without being asked. Read the situation before she walked into it. Her mother had done that too. "What's in the boxes?" she asked. "Engines," Callum said. "Are they broken?" He looked at the crates. He'd worked in automotive engineering for 11 years before he'd left to open this place. He'd rebuilt engines in a facility where the air was climate-controlled and the tools had serial numbers. He knew what a broken engine looked like from a distance the way a doctor knew what a broken arm looked like through a sleeve. "Probably," he said. Meg nodded, like this was useful information, and went back inside. The first engine he uncrated on a Thursday evening after he'd closed up, and Meg was at her homework at the kitchen table in the back of the building where they lived. He didn't rush. He set up his work light, put on the radio low, and pulled off the slats one by one with a pry bar. What he found was not quite what the invoice had described. The engine was a 1962 Coventry Marsh Inline-6, a racing variant that had been produced in a run of fewer than 200 units, most of which had either been destroyed in competition or scattered to private collectors across Europe. It had been wrapped in oilcloth that was 40 years old and still doing its job. Someone, at some point a very long time ago, had cared about this thing, had understood what it was. He crouched down and put his hand on the casing. The metal was cold. The cylinder head had a surface crack along the 3rd bore, visible, but not catastrophic. The valve cover was warped. The timing chain had seized somewhere in the last decade of sitting still. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a while. He thought about calling his brother in Sault Ste. Marie, who would have told him to sell the scrap and get on with his life. He thought about calling the Heritage Society and explaining that he was a one-man garage running on 14-hour days and a prayer, not a restoration facility. He thought about a lot of practical things. Then he got his notebook and started writing down what he'd need. He didn't tell anyone about the engines for the first few weeks. It wasn't a secret exactly. The crates were right there in the bay, visible through the window. But Callum wasn't the kind of man who talked about things until he had something to say. His wife Sandra had teased him about that. "You'll tell me you built a house when you hand me the keys," she'd said once. He'd laughed. He'd been planning to build her a house, actually. But then she'd gotten sick, and then she was gone, and the lot behind the garage was still empty. He worked on the engines in the evenings after Meg was in bed. The first one took 3 weeks just to assess properly. The second and third he uncrated together on a Sunday afternoon, and Meg sat on an upturned bucket and watched him work, asking questions with the relentless precision of a child who has decided that something is interesting. Why did they stop making them? She asked, about the Coventry Marsh. Regulations changed, Callum said. Racing rules went a different direction. These didn't fit anymore. So they just stopped? They stopped building them. Yeah, but they still work? He paused, wrench in hand. Potentially, he said. Meg considered this. That's sad, she said. Engines don't have feelings, Meg. I know, she said. I meant for the people who built them. He didn't have an answer for that. He went back to work. The news about the engines got out eventually, the way things get out in a town the size of Dunmore, which is to say all at once and from an unexpected direction. It was Brent Kowalski at the hardware store who mentioned to someone that Callum Webb had a bay full of vintage British racing engines, which got back to the local paper, which ran a small item, which caught the attention of a man named Douglas Frey, who drove up from Toronto in a Porsche Cayenne on a Tuesday morning and presented himself at the garage with a business card and a very specific kind of smile. Frey was a broker. He dealt in vintage automotive components and collectibles, worked with auction houses and private collectors, and he had the unhurried confidence of a man who understood that the things other people undervalued were the foundation of his livelihood. I'll give you 40,000, he said, surveying the engines with his hands in his pockets. For all 5, as is. They're not for sale, Callum said. Frey looked at him the way you look at someone who said something slightly eccentric at a dinner party. You understand what you have here? I do, Callum said. That's why they're not for sale. Frey left his card anyway. Callum put it in a drawer in the office where he kept things he might need and wouldn't look for. The 4th engine was the difficult one. It was a 1958 unit from a different manufacturer. A Fenwick Ross Racing 4, experimental, one of maybe 30 ever produced. It had a damaged crankshaft that Callum had not encountered in the initial assessment because the damage was internal and subtle, the kind of thing that revealed itself only when you started pulling the engine apart for a serious rebuild. He found it on a Friday night in February, bent over the workbench with a headlamp and a sinking feeling. A crankshaft for a Fenwick Ross 4 was not something you ordered from a catalog. There were no catalogs. There were barely records. He sat down on his stool and rubbed the bridge of his nose and thought about the invoice from Harwick Industries, which said these engines had been removed from a Sudbury property that was being demolished. He thought about what else might have been in that facility. He thought about whether someone at Harwick would know. He thought about it for a week before he made the call. The woman who answered at Harwick Industries was professional in the way that large corporate offices produce professional people, clipped, efficient, slightly impersonal. She transferred him twice before he reached a man named Patterson, who handled asset records from decommissioned properties. Patterson was more helpful. He pulled the records for the Sudbury facility while Callum was on hold, listening to a recording that told him Harwick Industries was committed to sustainable development. There were additional components stored at that location, Patterson said when he came back. Several crates of miscellaneous parts. Mechanical. They were disposed of before the clearance. Disposed of how? A pause. Landfill, most likely. The disposal contractor would have their own records. Callum closed his eyes briefly. Is there any chance, he said carefully, that any of those parts were documented before disposal? Another pause. Longer. I'd have to check the intake inventory from the original property acquisition. That goes back about 12 years. I can look. I'd appreciate that, Callum said. My name is Webb. You've got my number from the original donation file. Patterson said he'd be in touch. Callum hung up and looked at the Fenwick Ross on the bench and thought about crankshafts and landfills and the particular cruelty of losing something irreplaceable to negligence. Patterson called back in 10 days with a scanned inventory list that was 4 pages long and barely legible, photographed from a physical document that had been sitting in a file box for over a decade. Callum printed it and went through it line by line at the kitchen table, with Meg asleep down the hall. The list confirmed what he'd been afraid of and also gave him something he hadn't expected. The Sudbury facility had been, in a previous life, a private racing team's maintenance operation. There had been far more than 5 engines in storage. There had been parts, crated, cataloged by someone who'd known exactly what they were, covering 3 different engine families. Most of it was gone. but the intake inventory listed a contact name for the original property owner. The man who'd operated the facility before Harwick had purchased it. The name was Gerald Foss. An address in Sault Ste. Marie. Gerald Foss was 74 years old and lived in a bungalow on the north edge of the city, with a workshop behind the house that smelled of machine oil and cedar and thyme. He came to the door in a canvas shirt, with a coffee mug in his hand, and looked at Callum for a long moment before saying anything. "You're the one Patterson called about," he said. "Yes, sir," Callum said. "Come in, then." Foss had spent 40 years in motorsport as a mechanic, then as a team manager, then, in the final decade before his retirement, as an independent restorer working on exactly the kind of machinery that was currently sitting in Callum's bay. He'd heard about the donation through Patterson as well, and he had, he said, a few things to say about it. They sat at a kitchen table and Foss talked for 2 hours. About the Sudbury facility, which had been his, which he'd sold to Harwick 12 years ago when his wife got ill and the property taxes became impossible, and the company made an offer that solved the immediate problem at the cost of everything else. About the engines he'd stored there, which he'd intended to come back for, which he'd been told he could come back for, and which had been designated for disposal before he'd had any warning. "I didn't know they'd kept 5 of them," he said. "I thought they'd taken the lot. Someone in the clearance process must have flagged them," Callum said. The donation was arranged through the Heritage Society. Foss wrapped both hands around his mug. "Which 5? Callum told him. Watched the old man's face. "The Coventry Marsh 3s, Foss said quietly. "Good Lord, all 3 are restaurable. The Fenwick Ross 4 has a crankshaft issue." Foss looked up. "Internal?" "Fourth journal." "Subtle. I almost missed it." "You wouldn't find a replacement," Foss said. "Not stock. You'd have to have one machined." "I know," Callum said. "That's partly why I'm here." Foss studied him for a moment. He had the kind of face that had spent decades reading engines and, by extension, had gotten quite good at reading people. "What did you do before the garage?" he asked. Callum told him. The engineering work, the years at the automotive firm in Windsor, the decision to leave after Sandra died and move back to Dunmore where he'd grown up, and where Meg could be near her grandparents. Foss nodded slowly. "Can you machine a crankshaft?" "I can design one," Callum said. "I'd need a machinist I trust." "I know a machinist," Foss said. "Been retired 8 years. He'd come out of retirement for a Fenwick Ross." The thing about Catherine Harwick was that she did not, as it turned out, know what had been in the Sudbury facility when she'd bought it. This became relevant 4 months into the restoration, when a man named Bridwell from Harwick's legal department contacted Callum through a letter that was professionally worded and implied, without quite stating, that Harwick Industries had an ongoing interest in any assets that could be traced to properties they had acquired. The letter mentioned the Sudbury facility. It mentioned the engines. It was careful not to use the word ownership directly, but the word was there in the spaces between the sentences. Callum read the letter twice, and then called a lawyer in town named Steph Archer, who read it once and said, "This is a very politely written fishing expedition." "That's what I thought," Callum said. "The donation was legally executed," Archer said, "through the Heritage Society, which has charitable status. The transfer is clean. They don't have a claim." "They know that," Callum said. "Yes," Archer said. "This is what happens when someone large and well-resourced realizes they gave away something valuable by accident. They send letters." The letter from Bridwell was followed, 2 weeks later, by a phone call from a different person. Not Bridwell, not legal, but a woman who introduced herself as Diane Harwick, Catherine's sister, who sat on the board and handled, she said, community relations. Callum listened politely. Diane Harwick was sympathetic. She acknowledged the donation had been made in good faith. She suggested that Harwick Industries would be very interested in supporting the restoration financially, in exchange for certain considerations around the final disposition of the engines. "What kind of considerations?" Callum asked. "A right of first refusal," she said. "Should you decide to sell?" "I haven't decided anything yet," Callum said. "Of course," Diane said. "We're simply expressing interest." He thanked her and ended the call and went back to the 4th engine, where Gerald Foss's retired machinist, a man named Tran, who drove up from Sudbury every other weekend and had opinions about everything, was fitting the newly machined crankshaft journal with the focus of a man performing surgery. "Corporate?" Tran asked, without looking up. "Corporate," Callum confirmed. Tran made a sound that communicated everything he thought about that and went back to work. The fifth engine was the one that changed things. Callum had left it for last deliberately because it was in the worst cosmetic condition, and he'd assumed it was also in the worst mechanical condition. It was a 1961 unit, the casing badly corroded, the valve cover missing entirely, the intake manifold cracked in 2 places. He'd nearly written it off twice. What he found when he finally pulled the cylinder head, on a Tuesday evening in late April, with rain against the garage windows, and Meg at her school play rehearsal 2 blocks away, stopped him completely. The engine had been modified, internally, at the block level, in ways that were not documented anywhere in the available literature on this engine family. Someone had worked on this engine with extraordinary skill, and more than that, with an original idea, a modification to the oil circulation system that was elegant in the specific way that good engineering is elegant, which is to say, it solved a problem you might not have noticed, was a problem until the solution made it obvious. He took photographs, he took measurements. He wrote 4 pages of notes in his notebook, the handwriting getting smaller as he went, the way his handwriting always did when he was concentrating. He sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he called Foss. "Who built these engines?" he asked. "Originally, who modified them?" A pause on the line. Why? Because whoever modified the 5th one was working 30 years ahead of the published literature on this lubrication problem. And I'd like to know if there are records. A longer pause. "That would have been a man named Arthur Llewellyn," Foss said finally. "He was the team's chief engineer from about 58 to 65. He died in 1991. There may be records in the facility documentation. I kept his technical files when I took over the property. They're in boxes in my workshop." "Gerald," Callum said, "I need to see those files." The files were extraordinary. Llewellyn had been, by any reasonable measure, one of the most gifted racing engineers of his generation, and had never received recognition commensurate with that because he'd spent his career working for a small independent team that had competed at the margins of the sport and never attracted the kind of attention that generated obituaries in the right publications. He'd documented everything, 83 technical notebooks, hundreds of photographs, correspondence with engineers at other teams who'd been trying to solve the same problems he'd solved 20 years before they got there. Callum spent a weekend in Foss's workshop, going through the boxes. Foss sat nearby and talked when he had something to say and was quiet when he didn't, which was the correct behavior, and Callum appreciated it. "These should be in an archive," Callum said on the Sunday afternoon. "Yes," Foss said. "A proper one. University engineering collection, something like that." "I know," Foss said. "I've known for 20 years. But moving them takes money and organization, and I've been short of both." Callum looked at the notebooks spread across the workbench. He thought about Arthur Llewellyn working in a small facility in Sudbury, writing down everything he knew, trusting that it would matter to someone eventually. "I'll help you," he said, "after the restoration is done." Foss looked at him. "That's a significant commitment." "I know," Callum said. He closed a notebook carefully. "But the man did the work. Someone should make sure people know about it." The Harwick situation came to a head in June. Bridwell from legal sent a second letter, this one less polite, noting that Harwick Industries had retained an appraiser who had, on the basis of available documentation, estimated the value of the 5 engines at approximately $1.4 million. The letter suggested, in its precise legal language, that the original donation may have been made in error and requested a meeting to discuss remediation. Steph Archer called Callum before he'd had a chance to call her. "They had them appraised," she said. "I know, at $1.4 million. The appraiser didn't have access to the engines," Callum said, "or to Llewellyn's files. The 5th engine alone with the documentation." "How much?" Archer asked. Callum had done his own assessment. He'd spoken to 2 independent specialists, one in Toronto and one in Edinburgh, who'd been following the project via email correspondence and had not disguised his excitement. He'd thought about Frey and his $40,000 and the particular confidence of a man who understands that other people's undervaluation is his livelihood. "With the Llewellyn documentation," Callum said, "and the provenance we've been able to establish, the set is worth somewhere between $2.5 and $3 million. A silence on the line. "Callum," Archer said. "I know," he said, "and the donation is clean. You said it was." It is, she said. I'm just making sure we both understand what we're standing on here. I understand, Callum said. I want you to send a response to Bridwell. Politely, acknowledging their appraisal and noting that our own assessment differs considerably, and noting that the legal status of the donation has been reviewed and is not in question. And the meeting they requested, Callum thought about it. I'll meet with Catherine Harwick directly, he said. Not legal. Catherine Harwick drove up from Toronto herself, which was not what Callum had expected. He'd expected a representative, another layer of intermediary. Instead, she arrived in a dark SUV on a Thursday morning, alone except for a driver, and walked into the garage in clothing that was expensive in the way that very practical clothing is expensive. No indication of effort, just quality. She was in her mid-50s. She had the look of someone who had been making high-stakes decisions for so long that making them had become restful. She looked at the engines for a long time before she said anything. The 5 of them were lined up in the main bay, fully restored now, or as close to it as they would be before final detailing. The Coventry Marsh units were remarkable to look at. There was simply no other word, and the Fenwick Ross sat at the end of the row with a quiet authority that came from being a rare thing that had been treated with the seriousness it deserved. I didn't know what was there, Harwick said finally. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. I gathered that, Callum said. She turned to look at him. My property team assessed the facility as industrial decommission. The components were categorized as scrap. The decision to donate 5 units rather than dispose of them all was made by a junior coordinator based on a flag from the Heritage Society contact list. She paused. I'm telling you this not to establish a legal position. My legal people have already told me I don't have one. I'm telling you because I think you'd want to know how it happened. Callum looked at her. I appreciate that, he said. What are you going to do with them? It was a direct question. He gave her a direct answer. He'd been thinking about it for months. Since the Edinburgh specialist's email, since the weekend in Foss's workshop, since the evening he'd sat looking at Llewellyn's notebooks and thought about what it meant to do work that no one recognized while you were living. There's a collector in Calgary who's expressed serious interest in the set, he said. Private sale, full provenance documentation. The price will establish the Coventry Marsh and Fenwick Ross families in the market in a way they haven't been before. He paused. A portion of the proceeds is going toward archiving Arthur Llewellyn's technical records. Gerald Foss, the man who owned the Sudbury facility before you, has been working with those records for 40 years. They belong in a proper collection. Harwick was quiet for a moment. Who is Arthur Llewellyn? Callum told her. She listened the way people listen when they're genuinely revising their understanding of something. When he was done, she was quiet again. The modifications to the 5th engine, she said, they were significant. The engineering community's view, once the documentation is published, will be that Arthur Llewellyn solved a lubrication problem in 1961 that the industry didn't formally solve until the 1990s. Yes, significant. Harwick looked at the 5th engine, the corroded one, the one he'd nearly written off twice. I'd like to contribute to the archive, she said. Harwick Industries, as a donor. Callum looked at her. Not as a condition of anything, she said. Not in exchange for anything. The work sounds important and we discarded it. That should be corrected. He thought about Foss in his bungalow in the Salt, the boxes stacked in the workshop, 83 notebooks in the handwriting of a man who'd trusted that someone would care eventually. I'll pass that along to Gerald Foss, Callum said. It's his collection, his call. Harwick nodded. She looked at the engines once more. The row of them in the morning light, the smell of the bay around them, the particular quality of something that had been given back to itself. They're beautiful, she said. It came out simply without performance. They are, Callum agreed. The sale was completed in September to the collector in Calgary who drove up with a transport company and a certified appraisal and stood in the bay looking at the engines with the specific stillness of a person receiving something they had wanted for a long time. The final number was $2,800,000. Callum shook the man's hand and watched the engines go and felt, not quite lost, but something adjacent to it, the particular quiet of a finished thing. He called Foss that evening. It's done, he said. How much? Foss asked. Callum told him. A long silence. Arthur would have laughed, Foss said finally. He never thought any of it was worth much. He just thought it was worth doing. That's usually how it goes, Callum said. He was standing in the bay, now empty of the engines, the space larger than it had looked before they arrived. Meg came through the door from the house, in her school clothes, holding a piece of paper, wanting him to look at something she'd written. He gestured her over, and she leaned against his arm while he looked at the paper, and he put one hand on her shoulder. And the bay was just a bay again, full of the ordinary work of the next day and the day after that. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does in that part of the country. Going gold and going quickly, the kind of beauty that doesn't wait for you to be ready for it. He signed the thing Meg needed signed and handed it back to her, and she went inside. And he stood there a little longer in the fading light, in the place where the engines had been, thinking about the difference between things that are finished and things that are done.